The House of the Past by Algernon, Blackwood. One night, a dream came to me and brought with her an old and rusty key. She led me across fields and sweet-smelling lanes, where the hedges were already whispering to one another in the dark of the spring, till we came to a huge, gaunt house with staring windows and lofty roof half hidden in the shadows of very early morning. I noticed that the blinds were of heavy black, and that the house seemed wrapped in absolute stillness. "This," she whispered in my ear, "is the house of the past. Come with me, and we will go through some of its rooms and passages, but quickly, for I have not the key for long, and the night is very nearly over. Yet, perchance, you shall remember." The key made a dreadful noise as she turned it in the lock, and when the great door swung open into an empty hall, and we went in, I heard sounds of whispering and weeping, and the rustling of clothes, as of people moving in their sleep and about to wake. Then, instantly, a spirit of intense sadness came over me, drenching me to the soul. My eyes began to burn and smart, and in my heart I became aware of a strange sensation, as of the uncoiling of something that had been asleep for ages. My whole being, unable to resist, at once surrendered itself to the spirit of deepest melancholy, and the pain in my heart, as the things moved and woke, became in a moment of time too strong for words. As we advanced, the faint voices and sobbings fled away before us into the interior of the house, and I became conscious that the air was full of hands held aloft, of swaying garments, of drooping tresses, and of eyes so sad and wistful that the tears, which were already brimming in my own, held back for wonder at the sight of such intolerable yearning. "Do not allow all this sadness to overwhelm you," whispered the dream at my side. "It is not often they wake. They sleep for years and years and years. The chambers are all full, and unless visitors such as we come to disturb them, they will never wake of their own accord. But when one stirs, the sleep of the others is troubled, and they too awake, till the motion is communicated from one room to another, and thus finally throughout the whole house. Then, sometimes, the sadness is too great to be borne, and the mind weakens. For this reason, memory gives to them the sweetest and deepest sleep she has, and she keeps this old key rusty from little use. But listen now," she added, holding up her hand. "Do you not hear all through the house that trembling of the air, like the distant murmur of falling water? And do you not now, perhaps, remember?" Even before she spoke, I had already caught faintly the beginning of a new sound, and now, deep in the cellars beneath our feet, and from the upper regions of the great house as well, I heard the whispering and the rustling and the inward stirring of the sleeping shadows. It rose like a chord swept softly from huge unseen strings, stretched somewhere among the foundations of the house, and its tremblings ran gently through all its walls and ceilings. And I knew that I heard the slow awakening of the ghosts of the past. Ah me, with what terrible inrushing of sadness! I stood with brimming eyes and listened to the faint, dead voices of the long ago. For indeed, the whole house was awakening, and there presently rose to my nostrils the subtle, penetrating perfume of age, of letters long preserved, with ink faded and ribbons pale, of scented tresses, golden and brown, laid away, how tenderly, among pressed flowers that still held the inmost delicacy of their forgotten fragrance, the scented presence of lost memories, the intoxicating incense of the past. My eyes overflowed, my heart tightened and expanded, as I yielded myself up without reserve to these old influences of sound and smell. These ghosts of the past, forgotten in the tumult of more recent memories, thronged round me, took my hands in theirs, and, ever whispering of what I had so long forgot, ever sighing, shaking from their hair and garments the ineffable odors of the dead ages, led me through the vast house from room to room, from floor to floor. And the ghosts were not all equally clear to me. Some had indeed but the faintest life, and stirred me so little that they left only an indistinct blurred impression in the air, while others gazed half reproachfully at me out of faded, colorless eyes, as if longing to recall themselves to my recollection, and then, seeing they were not recognized, floated back gently into the shadows of their room, to sleep again, undisturbed, till the final day, when I should not fail to know them. Many of them have slept so long, said the dream beside me, that they wake only with the greatest difficulty. Once awake, however, they know and remember you, even though you fail to remember them. For it is the rule in this house of the past that, unless you recall them distinctly, remembering precisely when you knew them, and with what particular causes in your past evolution they were associated, they cannot stay awake. Unless you remember them when your eyes meet, unless their look of recognition is returned by you, they are obliged to go back to their sleep, silent and sorrowful, their hands unpressed, their voices unheard, to sleep and dream, deathless and patient, till. At this moment, her words died away suddenly into the distance, and I became conscious of an overpowering sensation of delight and happiness. Something had touched me on the lips, and a strong, sweet fire flashed down into my heart and sent the blood rushing tumultuously through my veins. My pulses beat wildly, my skin glowed, my eyes grew tender, and the terrible sadness of the place was instantly dispelled as if by magic. Turning with a cry of joy, that was at once swallowed up in the chorus of weeping and sighing round me, I looked, and instinctively stretched forth my arms in a rapture of happiness towards a vision of a face, hair, lips, eyes. A cloth of gold lay about the fair neck, and the old perfume of the East, ye stars, how long ago was in her breath. Her lips were again on mine, her hair over my eyes, her arms about my neck, and the love of her ancient soul pouring into mine out of eyes still starry and undimmed. Oh, the fierce tumult, the untold wonder, if I could only remember that subtle, mist-dispelling odor of many ages ago, once so familiar, before the hills of Atlantis were above the blue sea, or the sands had begun to form the bed of the Sphinx. Yet wait, it comes back. I begin to remember. Curtain upon curtain rises in my soul, and I can almost see beyond. But that hideous stretch of the years, awful and sinister, thousands upon thousands. My heart shakes, and I am afraid. Another curtain rises, and a new vista, farther than the others, comes into view. Interminable, running to a point among thick mists. Lo, they too are moving, rising, lightening. At last I shall see. Already I begin to recall. The dusky skin, the eastern grace, the wondrous eyes that held the knowledge of Buddha and the wisdom of Christ before these had even dreamed of attainment. As a dream within a dream, it steals over me again, taking compelling possession of my whole being. The slender form, the stars in that magical eastern sky, the whispering winds among the palm trees, the murmur of the river's waves, and the music of the reeds where they bend and sigh in the shallows on the golden sand. Thousands of years ago in some aeonian distance, it fades a little and begins to pass, then seems again to rise. Ah me, that smile of the shining teeth, those lace-veined lids. Oh, who will help me to recall? For it is too far away, too dim, and I cannot wholly remember, though my lips are still tingling, and my arms still outstretched. It again begins to fade. Already there is the look of sadness too deep for words, as she realizes that she is unrecognized. She, whose mere presence could once extinguish for me the entire universe. And she goes back slowly, mournfully, silently to her dim, tremendous sleep, to dream and dream of the day when I must remember her, and she must come where she belongs. She peers at me from the end of the room, where the shadows already cover her, and win her back with outstretched arms to her age-long sleep in the house of the past. Trembling all over, with the strange odor still in my nostrils and the fire in my heart, I turned away and followed my dream of a broad staircase into another part of the house. As we entered the upper corridors, I heard the wind pass singing over the roof. Its music took possession of me until I felt as though my whole body were a single heart, aching, straining, throbbing, as if it would break. And all because I heard the wind singing round this house of the past. But remember, whispered the dream, answering my unspoken wonder, that you are listening to the song it has sung for untold ages into untold myriad ears. It carries back so appallingly far, and in that simple dirge, profound in its terrible monotony, are the associations and recollections of the joys, griefs, and struggles of all your previous existence. The wind, like the sea, speaks to the inmost memory, she added, and that is why its voice is one of such deep spiritual sadness. It is the song of things forever incomplete, unfinished, unsatisfying. As we passed through the vaulted rooms, I noticed that no one stirred. There was no actual sound, only a general impression of deep collective breathing, like the heave of a muffled ocean. But the rooms, I knew at once, were full to the walls, crowded, rows upon rows, and from the floors below rose ever the murmur of the weeping shadows as they returned to their sleep and settled down again in the silence, the darkness, and the dust. The dust. Ah, the dust that floated in this house of the past. So thick, so penetrating, so fine, it filled the throat and eyes without pain. So fragrant, it soothed the senses and stilled the aching of the heart. So soft, it parched the tongue without offense, yet so silently falling, gathering, settling over everything, that the air held it like a fine mist, and the sleeping shadows wore it for their shrouds. And these are the oldest, said my dream, the longest to sleep, pointing to the crowded rows of silent sleepers. None here have wakened for ages, too many to count. And even if they woke, you would not know them. They are, like the others, all your own, but they are the memories of your earliest stages along the great path of evolution. Some day, though, they will awake, and you must know them and answer their questions, for they cannot die till they have exhausted themselves again through you who gave them birth. Ah me, I thought, only half listening to or understanding these last words. What mothers, fathers, brothers may then be asleep in this room? What faithful lovers? What true friends? What ancient enemies? And to think that some day they will step forth and confront me, and I shall meet their eyes again, claim them, know them, forgive and be forgiven, the memories of all my past. I turned to speak to the dream at my side, but she was already fading into dimness. And as I looked again, the whole house melted away into the flush of the eastern sky. And I heard the birds singing, and saw the clouds overhead veiling the stars in the light of coming day. The Messenger by Algernon, Blackwood. I have never been afraid of ghostly things, attracted rather with a curious live interest, though it is always out of doors that strange presences get nearest to me. And in nature, I have encountered warnings, messages, presentiments, and the like, that by way of help or guidance have later justified themselves. I have, therefore, welcomed them. But in the little rooms of houses, things of much value rarely come, for the thick air chokes the wires, as it were, and distorts or mutilates the clear delivery. But the other night, here in the carpenter's house, where my attic windows beckon to the mountains and the woods, I woke with the uncomfortably strong suggestion that something was on the way, and that I was not ready. It came along the byways of deep sleep. I awoke abruptly, alarmed before I was even properly awake. Something was approaching with great swiftness, and I was unprepared. Across the lake, there were faint signs of color behind the distant Alps, but terraces of mist still lay gray above the vineyards, and the slim poplar, whose tip was level with my face, no more than rustled in the wind of dawn. A shiver, not brought to me by any wind, ran through my nerves. For I knew with a certainty, no arguing could lessen nor dispel, that something from immensely far away was deliberately now approaching me. The touch of wonder in advance of it was truly awful. Its splendor, size, and grandeur belonged to conditions I had surely never known. It came through empty spaces, from another world. While I lay asleep, It had been already on the way. I stood there a moment, seeking for some outward sign that might betray its nature. The last stars were fading in the northern sky, and blue and dim lay the whole long line of the Jura, cloaked beneath still slumbering forests. There was a rumbling of a distant train. Now and then a dog barked in some outlying farm. The night was up and walking, though as yet she moved but slowly from the sky. Shadows still draped the world, and the warning that had reached me first in sleep rushed through my tingling nerves once more with a certainty not far removed from shock. Something from another world was drawing every minute nearer, and with a speed that made me tremble and half breathless. It would presently arrive. It would stand close beside me and look straight into my face, into these very eyes that searched the mist and shadow for an outward sign. It would gaze intimately with a message brought from me alone. But in these narrow walls, it could only come with difficulty. The message would be maimed. There still was time for preparation, and I hurried into clothes and made my way downstairs and out into the open air. Thus, at first by climbing fast, I kept ahead of it, and soon the village lay beneath me in its nest of shadow, and the limestone ridges far above dropped nearer. But the awe and the terrible deep wonder did not go. Along these mountain paths, whose every inch was so intimate that I could follow them even in the dark, this sense of breaking grandeur clung to my footsteps, keeping close. Nothing upon the earth, familiar, friendly, well-known little earth, could have brought this sense that pressed upon the edges of true reverence. It was the awareness that some speeding messenger from spaces far, far beyond the world would presently stand close and touch me, would gaze into my little human eyes, would leave its message as of life or death, and then depart upon its fearful way again. It was this that conveyed the feeling of apprehension that went with me. And instinctively, while rising higher and higher, I chose the darkest and most sheltered way. I sought the protection of the trees and ran into the deepest vaults of the forest. The moss was soaking wet beneath my feet, and the thousand tapering spires of the pines dipped upwards into a sky already brightening with palest gold and crimson. There was a whispering and rustling overhead as the trees, who know everything before it comes, announced to one another that the thing I sought to hide from was already very, very near. Plunging deeper into the woods to hide, this detail of sure knowledge followed me and laughed. That the speed of this august arrival was one which made the greatest speed I ever dreamed of a mere standing still. I hid myself where possible in the darkness that was growing every minute more rare. The air was sharp and exquisitely fresh. I heard birds calling. The low wet branches kissed my face and hair. A sense of glad relief came over me, that I had left the closeness of the little attic chamber, and that I should eventually meet this huge newcomer in the wide free spaces of the mountains. There must be room where I could hold myself unmanacled to meet it. The village lay far beneath me, a patch of smoke and mist and soft brown roofs among the vineyards. And then my gaze turned upwards, and through a rift in the close-wrought ceiling of the trees, I saw the clearness of the open sky. A strip of cloud ran through it, carrying off the night's last dream. And down into my heart dropped instantly that cold breath of awe I have known but once in life, when staring through the stupendous mouth within the Milky Way. That opening into the outer spaces of eternal darkness, unlit by any single star, men call the coal hole. The futility of escape then took me bodily, and I renounced all further flight. From this speeding messenger, there was no hiding possible. His splendid shoulders already brushed the sky. I heard the rushing of his awful wings, yet in that deep, significant silence with which light steps upon the clouds of morning. And simultaneously I left the woods behind me and stood upon a naked ridge of rock that all night long had watched the stars. Then terror passed away like magic. Cool winds from the valleys bore me up. I heard the tinkling of 1,000 cowbells from pastures far below in a score of hidden valleys. The cold departed, and with it every trace of little fears. My eyes seemed for an instant blinded, and I knew that deep sense of joy which seems so unearthly that it almost stains the sight with the veils of tears. The soul sank to her knees in prayer and worship. For the messenger from another world had come. He stood beside me on that dizzy ledge. Warmth clothed me, and I knew myself akin to deity. He stood there, gazing straight into my little human eyes. He touched me everywhere. Above the distant Alps the sun came up. His eye looked close into my own. The Return by Algernon, Blackwood. It was curious, that sense of dull uneasiness that came over him so suddenly. So stealthily at first, he scarcely noticed it, but with such marked increase after a time, that he presently got up and left the theater. His seat was on the gangway of the dress circle, and he slipped out awkwardly in the middle of what seemed to be the best and jolliest song of the piece. The full house was shaking with laughter. So infectious was the gaiety that even strangers turned to one another, as much as to say, "Now isn't that funny?" It was curious, too, the way the feeling first got into him at all, and in the full swing of laughter, music, lightheartedness. For it came as a vague suggestion. I've forgotten something I meant to do, something of importance. What in the world was it now? And he thought hard, searching vainly through his mind, then dismissed it, as the dancing caught his attention. It came back a little later again, during a passage of long-winded talk that bored him and set his attention free once more, but came more strongly this time, insisting on an answer. What could it have been that he had overlooked, left undone, omitted to see to? It went on, nibbling at the subconscious part of him. Several times this happened, this dismissal and return, till at last the thing declared itself more plainly, and he felt bothered, troubled, distinctly uneasy. He was wanted somewhere. There was somewhere else he ought to be. That describes it best, perhaps. Some engagement of moment had entirely slipped his memory. an engagement that involved another person too, but where, what, with whom? And at length, this vague uneasiness amounted to positive discomfort, so that he felt unable to enjoy the peace, and left abruptly. Like a man to whom comes suddenly the horrible idea that the match he lit his cigarette with and flung into the wastepaper basket on leaving was not really out, a sort of panic distress. He jumped into a taxicab and hurried to his flat to find everything in order. Of course, no smoke, no fire, no smell of burning. But this evening was spoiled. He sat smoking in his armchair at home, this businessman of 40, practical in mind, of character some called stolid, cursing himself for an imaginative fool. It was now too late to go back to the theater. The club bored him. He spent an hour with the evening papers, dipping into books, sipping a long cool drink, doing odds and ends about the flat. "I'll go to bed early for a change," he laughed. But really all the time fighting. Yes, deliberately fighting. This strange attack of uneasiness that so insidiously grew outwards from the very depths of him that sought so strenuously to deny it. It never occurred to him that he was ill. He was not ill. His health was thunderingly good. He was as robust as a coal heaver. The flat was roomy, high on the top floor, yet in a busy part of town, so that the roar of traffic mounted round it like a sea. Through the open windows came the fresh night air of June. He had never noticed before how sweet the London night air could be, and that not all the smoke and dust could smother a certain touch of wild fragrance that tinctured it with perfume. Yes, almost perfume, as of the country. He swallowed a draught of it as he stood there, staring out across the tangled world of roofs and chimney pots. He saw the procession of the clouds. He saw the stars. He saw the moonlight falling in a shower of silver spears upon the slates and wires and steeples. And something in him quickened, something that had never stirred before. He turned with a horrid start, for the uneasiness had of a sudden leaped within him like an animal. There was someone in the flat. Instantly, with action, even this slight action, the fancy vanished. But, all the same, he switched on the electric lights and made a search. For it seemed to him that someone had crept up close behind him while he stood there watching the night. Someone whose silent presence fingered with unerring touch both this new thing that had quickened in his heart and that sense of original deep uneasiness. He was amazed at himself, angry, indignant that he could be thus foolishly upset over nothing, yet at the same time profoundly distressed at this vehement growth of a new thing in his well-ordered personality. Growth, he dismissed the word the moment it occurred to him. But it had occurred to him. It stayed. While he searched the empty flat, the long passages, the gloomy bedroom at the end, the little hall where he kept his overcoats and golf sticks, it stayed. Growth. It was oddly disquieting. Growth to him involved, though he neither acknowledged nor recognized the truth perhaps, some kind of undesirable changeableness, instability, unbalance. Yet, singular as it all was, he realized that the uneasiness and the sudden appreciation of beauty that was so new to him had both entered by the same door into his being. When he came back to the front room, he noticed that he was perspiring. There were little drops of moisture on his forehead, and down his spine ran chills, little faint quivers of cold. He was shivering. He lit his big meerschaum pipe and left the lights all burning. The feeling that there was something he had overlooked, forgotten, left undone, had vanished. Whatever the original cause of this absurd uneasiness might be, he called it absurd on purpose because he now realized, in the depths of him, that it was really more vital than he cared about. It was much nearer to discovery than before. It dodged about just below the threshold of discovery. It was as close as that. Any moment he would know what it was. He would remember. Yes, he would remember. Meanwhile, he was in the right place. No desire to go elsewhere afflicted him, as in the theater. Here was the place. Here, in the flat. And then it was with a kind of sudden burst and rush. It seemed to him the only way to phrase it. Memory gave up her dead. At first, he only caught her peeping round the corner at him, drawing aside a corner of an enormous curtain, as it were, striving for more complete entrance, as though the mass of it were difficult to move. But he understood, he knew, he recognized. It was enough for that. As an entrance into his being, heart, mind, soul, was being attempted, and the entrance, because of his stolid temperament, was difficult of accomplishment, there was effort, strain. Something in him had first to be opened up, widened, made soft and ready, as by an operation, before full entrance could be effected. This much he grasped, though for the life of him he could not have put it into words. Also, he knew who it was that sought an entrance. Deliberately from himself he withheld the name. But he knew, as surely as though Strawn stood in the room and faced him with a knife, saying, "Let me in. Let me in. I wish you to know I'm here. I'm clearing away. You recall our promise." He rose from his chair and went to the open window again, the strange fear slowly passing. The cool air fanned his cheeks. Beauty till now had scarcely ever brushed the surface of his soul. He had never troubled his head about it. It passed him by indifferent, and he had ever loathed the mouthy pleading of it on others' lips. He was practical. Beauty was for dreamers, for women, for men who had means and leisure. He had not exactly scorned it. Rather, it had never touched his life to sweeten, to cheer, to uplift. Artists, for him, were like monks, another sex almost, useless beings who never helped the world go round. He was for action always, work, activity, achievement as he saw them. He remembered Strawn vaguely. Strawn, the ever impecunious friend of his youth, always talking of color and sound, mysterious, ineffectual things. He even forgot what they had quarreled about, if they had quarreled at all even, or why they had gone apart all these years ago. And certainly he had forgotten any promise. Memory as yet only peeped at him round the corner of that huge curtain tentatively, suggestively, yet he was obliged to admit it, somewhat winningly. He was conscious of this gentle, sweet seductiveness that now replaced his fear. And as he stood now at the open window, peering over huge London, beauty came close and smote him between the eyes. She came blindingly, with her train of stars and clouds and perfumes. Night, mysterious, myriad-eyed, and flaming across her sea of haunted shadows, invaded his heart, and shook him with her immemorial wonder and delight. He found no words, of course, to clothe the new unwanted sensations. He only knew that all his former dread, uneasiness, distress, and with them this idea of growth that had seemed so repugnant to him, were merged, swept up, and gathered magnificently home into a wave of beauty that enveloped him. See it and understand, ran a secret inner whisper across his mind. He saw, he understood. He went back and turned the lights out. Then he took his place again at that open window, drinking in the night. He saw a new world. A species of intoxication held him. He sighed as his thoughts blundered for expression among words and sentences that knew him not. But the delight was there, the wonder, the mystery. He watched, with heart alternately tightening and expanding, the transfiguring play of moon and shadow over the sea of buildings. He saw the dance of the hurrying clouds, the open patches into outer space, the veiling and unveiling of that ancient silvery face, and he caught strange whispers of the hierophantic sacerdotal power that has echoed down the world since time began, and dropped strange magic phrases into every poet's heart, since first God dawned on chaos, the beauty of the night. A long time passed. It may have been 1 hour, it may have been 3, when at length he turned away and went slowly to his bedroom. A deep peace lay over him. Something quite new and blessed had crept into his life and thought. He could not quite understand it all. He only knew that it uplifted. There was no longer the least sign of affliction or distress. Even the inevitable reaction that set in could not destroy that. And then, as he lay in his bed, nearing the borderland of sleep, suddenly, and without any obvious suggestion to bring it, he remembered another thing. He remembered the promise. Memory got past the big curtain for an instant and showed her face. She looked into his eyes. It must have been a dozen years ago when Strawn and he had made that foolish, solemn promise that whoever died first should show himself, if possible, to the other. He had utterly forgotten it till now. But Strawn had not forgotten it. The letter came 3 weeks later from India. That very evening Strawn had died at 9 o'clock. And he had come back in the beauty that he loved.
The Squaw by Bram Stoker. Nuremberg at the time was not so much exploited as it has been since then. Irving had not been playing Faust, and the very name of the old town was hardly known to the great bulk of the travelling public. My wife and I, being on the second week of our honeymoon, naturally wanted someone else to join our party, so that when the cheery stranger, Elias P. Hutcheson, hailing from Isthmian City, Bleeding Gulch, Maple Tree County, Nebraska, turned up at the station at Frankfort, and casually remarked that he was going on to see the most all-fired old Methuselah of a town in Europe, and that he guessed that so much travelling alone was enough to send an intelligent, active citizen into the melancholy ward of a daft house, we took the pretty broad hint and suggested that we join forces. We found, on comparing notes afterwards, that we had each intended to speak with some diffidence or hesitation, so as not to appear too eager, such not being a good compliment to the success of our married life, but the effect was entirely marred by our both beginning to speak at the same instant, stopping simultaneously and then going on together again. Anyhow, no matter how, it was done, and Elias P. Hutcheson became one of our party. Straightway Amelia and I found the pleasant benefit. Instead of quarrelling, as we had been doing, we found that the restraining influence of a third party was such that we now took every opportunity of spooning in odd corners. Amelia declares that ever since she has, as a result of that experience, advised all her friends to take a friend on the honeymoon. Well, we did Nuremberg together, and much enjoyed the racy remarks of our transatlantic friend, who, from his quaint speech and his wonderful stock of adventures, might have stepped out of a novel. We kept for the last object of interest in the city to be visited, the Burg, and on the day appointed for the visit, strolled round the outer wall of the city by the eastern side. The Burg is seated on a rock dominating the town, and an immensely deep fosse guards it on the northern side. Nuremberg has been happy in that it was never sacked. Had it been, it would certainly not be so spick and span perfect as it is at present. The ditch has not been used for centuries, and now its base is spread with tea gardens and orchards, of which some of the trees are of quite respectable growth. As we wandered round the wall, dawdling in the hot July sunshine, we often paused to admire the view spread before us, and in especial the great plain covered with towns and villages, and bounded with a blue line of hills, like a landscape of Claude Lorraine. From this we always turned with new delight to the city itself, with its myriad of quaint old gables and acre-wide red roofs dotted with dormer windows, tier upon tier. A little to our right rose the towers of the Burg, and nearer still, standing grim, the Torture Tower, which was, and is perhaps, the most interesting place in the city. For centuries the tradition of the Iron Virgin of Nuremberg has been handed down as an instance of the horrors of cruelty of which man is capable. We had long looked forward to seeing it, and here at last was its home. In one of our pauses we leaned over the wall of the moat and looked down. The garden seemed quite 50 or 60 feet below us, and the sun pouring into it with an intense, moveless heat like that of an oven. Beyond rose the grim grey wall, seemingly of endless height, and losing itself right and left in the angles of bastion and counterscarp. Trees and bushes crowned the wall, and above again towered the lofty houses on whose massive beauty time has only set the hand of approval. The sun was hot, and we were lazy. Time was our own, and we lingered, leaning on the wall. Just below us was a pretty sight. A great black cat lying stretched in the sun, whilst round her gambolled prettily a tiny black kitten. The mother would wave her tail for the kitten to play with, or would raise her feet and push away the little one as an encouragement to further play. They were just at the foot of the wall, and Elias P. Hutcheson, in order to help the play, stooped and picked up from the walk a moderate-sized pebble. "See," he said, I will drop it near the kitten, and they will both wonder where it came from." "Oh, be careful," said my wife. "You might hit the dear little thing." "Not me, ma'am," said Elias P. "Why, I'm as tender as a Maine cherry tree, Lor bless ye. I wouldn't hurt the poor pooty little critter more'n I'd scalp a baby. And you may bet your variegated socks on that. See, I'll drop it fur away on the outside so's not to go near her." Thus saying, he leaned over and held his arm out at length and dropped the stone. It may be that there is some attractive force which draws lesser matters to greater, or more probably that the wall was not plump, but sloped to its base, we not noticing the inclination from above. But the stone fell with a sickening thud that came up to us through the hot air, right on the kitten's head, and shattered out its little brains then and there. The black cat cast a swift upward glance, and we saw her eyes like green fire fixed an instant on Elias P. Hutchinson. And then her attention was given to the kitten, which lay still with just a quiver of her tiny limbs, whilst a thin red stream trickled from a gaping wound. With a muffled cry, such as a human being might give, she bent over the kitten, licking its wounds and moaning. Suddenly she seemed to realize that it was dead, and again threw her eyes up at us. I shall never forget the sight, for she looked the perfect incarnation of hate. Her green eyes blazed with lurid fire, and the sharp white teeth seemed almost to shine through the blood which dabbled her mouth and whiskers. She gnashed her teeth, and her claws stood out stark and at full length on every paw. Then she made a wild rush up the wall as if to reach us, but when the momentum ended, fell back, and further added to her horrible appearance, for she fell on the kitten and rose with her black fur smeared with its brains and blood. Amelia turned quite faint, and I had to lift her back from the wall. There was a seat close by in shade of a spreading plane tree, and here I placed her whilst she composed herself. Then I went back to Hutcheson, who stood without moving, looking down on the angry cat below. As I joined him, he said, "Well, I guess that air the savagest beast I ever see, 'cept once when an Apache squaw had an edge on a half-breed what they nicknamed Splinters, 'cause of the way he fixed up her papoose, which he stole on a raid just to show that he appreciated the way they had given his mother the fire torture. She got that kinder look so set on her face that it jest seemed to grow there. She follered Splinters more'n 3 year, till at last the braves got him and handed him over to her. They did say that no man, white or Injun, had ever been so long a-dying under the tortures of the Apaches. The only time I ever see her smile was when I wiped her out. I kim on the camp just in time to see Splinters passing his checks, and he wasn't sorry to go either. He was a hard citizen, and though I never could shake hands with him after that papoose business, for it was bitter bad, and he should have been a white man, for he looked like one, I see he got paid out in full. Dern me, but I took a piece of his hide from one of his skinning posts, and had it made into a pocket-book. It's here now." And he slapped the breast pocket of his coat. Whilst he was speaking, the cat was continuing her frantic efforts to get up the wall. She would take a run back, and then charge up, sometimes reaching an incredible height. She did not seem to mind the heavy fall which she got each time, but started with renewed vigor, and at every tumble her appearance became more horrible. Hutcheson was a kind-hearted man. My wife and I had both noticed little acts of kindness to animals as well as to persons, and he seemed concerned at the state of fury to which the cat had wrought herself. "Well, now," he said, "I do declare that poor critter seems quite desperate. There, poor thing, it was all an accident, though that won't bring back your little one to you. Say, I wouldn't have had such a thing happen for 1,000. Just shows what a clumsy fool of a man can do when he tries to play. Seems I'm too darn slipper-handed to even play with a cat. Say, Colonel," it was a pleasant way he had to bestow titles freely, "I hope your wife don't hold no grudge against me on account of this unpleasantness. Why, I wouldn't have had it occur on no account." He came over to Amelia and apologized profusely, and she, with her usual kindness of heart, hastened to assure him that she quite understood that it was an accident. Then we all went again to the wall and looked over. The cat, missing Hutcheson's face, had drawn back across the moat, and was sitting on her haunches as though ready to spring. Indeed, the very instant she saw him, she did spring, and with a blind, unreasoning fury which would have been grotesque, only that it was so frightfully real. She did not try to run up the wall, but simply launched herself at him, as though hate and fury could lend her wings to pass straight through the great distance between them. Amelia, womanlike, got quite concerned, and said to Elias P. in a warning voice, "Oh, you must be very careful. That animal would try to kill you if she were here. Her eyes look like positive murder." He laughed out jovially. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, "but I can't help laughing. Fancy a man that has fought grizzlies and Injuns being careful of being murdered by a cat." When the cat heard him laugh, her whole demeanor seemed to change. She no longer tried to jump or run up the wall, but went quietly over, and sitting again beside the dead kitten, began to lick and fondle it, as though it were alive. "See," said I, "the effect of a really strong man. Even that animal in the midst of her fury recognizes the voice of a master, and bows to him." "Like a squaw," was the only comment of Elias P. Hutcheson, as we moved on our way round the city fosse. Every now and then we looked over the wall, and each time saw the cat following us. At first she kept going back to the dead kitten, and then, as the distance grew greater, took it in her mouth and so followed. After a while, however, she abandoned this, for we saw her following all alone. She had evidently hidden the body somewhere. Amelia's alarm grew at the cat's persistence, and more than once she repeated her warning, but the American always laughed with amusement, till finally, seeing that she was beginning to be worried, he said, "I say, ma'am, you needn't be skeered over that cat. I go heeled, I do." Here he slapped his pocket pistol at the back of his lumbar region. "Why, sooner'n have you worried, I'll shoot the critter right here, and risk the police interfering with a citizen of the United States for carrying arms contrary to regulations." As he spoke, he looked over the wall, but the cat, on seeing him, retreated with a growl into a bed of tall flowers, and was hidden. He went on, "Blessed if that ar critter ain't got more sense of what's good for her than most Christians. I guess we've seen the last of her. You bet she'll go back now to that busted kitten and have a private funeral of it, all to herself." Amelia did not like to say more, lest he might, in mistaken kindness to her, fulfill his threat of shooting the cat, and so we went on, and crossed the little wooden bridge leading to the gateway whence ran the steep paved roadway between the burg and the pentagonal torture tower. As we crossed the bridge, we saw the cat again down below us. When she saw us, her fury seemed to return, and she made frantic efforts to get up the steep wall. Hutcheson laughed as he looked down at her, and said, "Goodbye, old girl. Sorry I injured your feelings, but you'll get over it in time. So long." And then we passed through the long, dim archway, and came to the gate of the burg. When we came out again, after our survey of this most beautiful old place, which not even the well-intentioned efforts of the Gothic restorers of 40 years ago have been able to spoil, though their restoration was then glaring white, we seemed to have quite forgotten the unpleasant episode of the morning. The old lime-tree, with its great trunk gnarled with the passing of nearly 9 centuries, the deep well cut through the heart of the rock by those captives of old, and the lovely view from the city wall whence we heard, spread over almost a full quarter of an hour, the multitudinous chimes of the city, had all helped to wipe out from our minds the incident of the slain kitten. We were the only visitors who had entered the torture tower that morning, so at least said the old custodian, and as we had the place all to ourselves, were able to make a minute and most satisfactory survey than would have otherwise been possible. The custodian, looking to us as the sole source of his gains for the day, was willing to meet our wishes in any way. The torture tower is truly a grim place. even now when many thousands of visitors have sent a stream of life, and the joy that follows life, into the place. But at the time I mention, it wore its grimmest and most gruesome aspect. The dust of the ages seemed to have settled on it, and the darkness and the horror of its memories seemed to have become sentient in a way that would have satisfied the pantheistic souls of Philo or Spinoza. The lower chamber, where we entered, was seemingly in its normal state, filled with incarnate darkness. Even the hot sunlight streaming in through the door seemed to be lost in the vast thickness of the walls, and only showed the masonry rough as when the builder's scaffolding had come down, but coated with dust, and marked here and there with patches of dark stain, which, if walls could speak, could have given their own dread memories of fear and pain. We were glad to pass up the dusty wooden staircase, the custodian leaving the outer door open to light us somewhat on our way, for to our eyes the one long-wicked, evil-smelling candle stuck in a sconce on the wall gave an inadequate light. When we came up through the open trap in the corner of the chamber overhead, Amelia held on to me so tightly that I could actually feel her heart beat. I must say for my own part that I was not surprised at her fear, for this room was even more gruesome than that below. Here there was certainly more light, but only just sufficient to realize the horrible surroundings of the place. The builders of the tower had evidently intended that only they who should gain the top should have any of the joys of light and prospect. There, as we had noticed from below, were ranges of windows, albeit of medieval smallness, but elsewhere in the tower were only a very few narrow slits, such as were habitual in places of medieval defence. A few of these only lit the chamber, and these so high up in the wall that from no part could the sky be seen through the thickness of the walls. In racks, and leaning in disorder against the walls, were a number of headsmen's swords, great double-handed weapons with broad blade and keen edge. Hard by were several blocks whereon the necks of the victims had lain, with here and there deep notches where the steel had bitten through the guard of flesh and shored into the wood. Round the chamber, placed in all sorts of irregular ways, were many implements of torture, which made one's heart ache to see, chairs full of spikes, which gave instant and excruciating pain, chairs and couches with dull knobs, whose torture was seemingly less, but which, though slower, were equally efficacious, racks, belts, boots, gloves, collars, all made for compressing at will, steel baskets in which the head could be slowly crushed into a pulp if necessary, watchmen's hooks with long handle and knife that cut at resistance, this a specialty of the old Nuremberg police system, and many, many other devices for man's injury to man. Amelia grew quite pale with the horror of the things, but fortunately did not faint, for being a little overcome she sat down on a torture chair, but jumped up again with a shriek, all tendency to faint gone. We both pretended that it was the injury done to her dress by the dust of the chair and the rusty spikes which had upset her, and Mr. Hutcheson acquiesced in accepting the explanation with a kind-hearted laugh. But the central object of the whole of this chamber of horrors was the engine known as the Iron Virgin, which stood near the centre of the room. It was a rudely shaped figure of a woman, something of the bell order, or, to make a closer comparison, of the figure of Mrs. Noah in the Children's Ark, but without that slimness of waist and perfect rondeur of hip which marks the aesthetic type of the Noah family. One would hardly have recognized it as intended for a human figure at all, had not the founder shaped on the forehead a rude semblance of a woman's face. This machine was coated with rust without, and covered with dust. A rope was fastened to a ring in the front of the figure, about where the waist should have been, and was drawn through a pulley fastened on the wooden pillar which sustained the flooring above. The custodian, pulling this rope, showed that a section of the front was hinged like a door at one side. We then saw that the engine was of considerable thickness, leaving just room enough inside for a man to be placed. The door was of equal thickness and of great weight, for it took the custodian all his strength, aided though he was by the contrivance of the pulley, to open it. This weight was partly due to the fact that the door was of manifest purpose hung so as to throw its weight downward, so that it might shut of its own accord when the strain was released. The inside was honeycombed with rust, nay more, the rust alone that comes through time would hardly have eaten so deep into the iron walls. The rust of the cruel stains was deep indeed. It was only, however, when we came to look at the inside of the door that the diabolical intention was manifest to the full. Here were several long spikes, square and massive, broad at the base and sharp at the points, placed in such a position that when the door should close, the upper ones would pierce the eyes of the victim, and the lower ones his heart and vitals. The sight was too much for poor Amelia, and this time she fainted dead off, and I had to carry her down the stairs and place her on a bench outside till she recovered. That she felt it to the quick was afterwards shown by the fact that my eldest son bears to this day a rude birthmark on his breast, which has by family consent been accepted as representing the Nurnberg Virgin. When we got back to the chamber, we found Hutcheson still opposite the Iron Virgin. He had been evidently philosophizing, and now gave us the benefit of his thought in the shape of a sort of exordium.
"Well, I guess I've been learning something here while Madam has been getting over her faint. 'Pears to me that we're a long way behind the times on our side of the big drink. We used to think out on the plains that the Injun could give us points in trying to make a man uncomfortable, but I guess your old medieval law and order party could raise him every time. Splinters was pretty good in his bluff on the squaw, while this here young miss held a straight flush all high on him. The points of them spikes air sharp enough still, though even the edges air eaten out by what used to be on them. It'd be a good thing for our Indian section to get some specimens of this here play toy to send round to the reservations, just to knock the stuffing out of the bucks, and the squaws too, by showing them how old civilization lays over them at its best. Guess but I'll get in that box a minute, just to see how it feels."
"Oh, no, no," said Amelia. "It's too terrible."
"Guess, ma'am, nothing's too terrible to the exploring mind. I've been in some queer places in my time. Spent a night inside a dead horse while a prairie fire swept over me in Montana territory, and another time slept inside a dead buffler when the Comanches was on the warpath, and I didn't keer to leave my kyard on them. I've been 2 days in a caved-in tunnel in the Billy Bronco gold mine in New Mexico, and was one of the 4 shut up for 3 parts of a day in the caisson what slid over on her side when we was setting the foundations of the Buffalo Bridge. I've not funked an odd experience yet, and I don't propose to begin now."
We saw that he was set on the experiment, so I said, "Well, hurry up, old man, and get through it quick."
"All right, General," said he, "but I calculate we ain't quite ready yet. The gentleman, my predecessors, what stood in that there canister, didn't volunteer for the office, not much, and I guess there was some ornamental tying up before the big stroke was made. I want to go into this thing fair and square, so I must get fixed up proper first. I dare say this old galoot can rise some string and tie me up according to sample."
This was said interrogatively to the old custodian, but the latter, who understood the drift of his speech, though perhaps not appreciating to the full the niceties of dialect and imagery, shook his head. His protest was, however, only formal, and made to be overcome. The American thrust a gold piece into his hand, saying, "Take it, pard, it's your pot, and don't be skeered. This ain't no necktie party that you're asked to assist in." He produced some thin frayed rope, and proceeded to bind our companion with sufficient strictness for the purpose. When the upper part of his body was bound, Hutcheson said, "Hold on a moment, Judge. Guess I'm too heavy for you to tote into the canister. You just let me walk in, and then you can wash up regarding my legs." Thus speaking, he had backed himself into the opening, which was just enough to hold him. It was a close fit, and no mistake. Amelia looked on with fear in her eyes, but she evidently did not like to say anything. The custodian completed his task by tying the American's feet together, so that he was now absolutely helpless and fixed in his voluntary prison. He seemed to really enjoy it, and the incipient smile which was habitual to his face blossomed into actuality as he said,
"Guess this here Eve was made out of the rib of a dwarf. There ain't much room for a full-grown citizen of the United States to hustle. We used to make our coffins more roomier in Idaho territory. Now, Judge, you just begin to let this door down, slow onto me. I want to feel the same pleasure as the other jays had when those spikes began to move towards their eyes."
"Oh, no, no, no!" broke in Amelia hysterically. "It's too terrible! I can't bear to see it! I can't! But the American was obdurate.
"Say, Colonel," said he, "why not take Madam for a little promenade? I wouldn't hurt her feelings for the world, but now that I am here, having come 8,000 miles, wouldn't it be too hard to give up the very experience I've been pining and panting for? A man can't get to feel like canned goods every time. Me and the judge here'll fix up this thing in no time, and then you'll come back and we'll all laugh together."
Once more the resolution that is born of curiosity triumphed, and Amelia stayed, holding tight to my arm and shivering, whilst the custodian began to slacken slowly, inch by inch, the rope that held back the iron door. Hutcheson's face was positively radiant as his eyes followed the first movement of the spikes.
"Well," he said, "I guess I've not had enjoyment like this since I left New York, bar a scrap with a French sailor at Wapping, and that weren't much of a picnic neither. I've not had a show for real pleasure in this dod-rotted continent, where there ain't no bars nor no Injuns, and where nary man goes healed. Slow there, Judge, don't you rush this business. I want a show for my money this game, I do."
The custodian must have had in him some of the blood of his predecessors in that ghastly tower, for he worked the engine with a deliberate and excruciating slowness, which after 5 minutes, in which the outer edge of the door had not moved half as many inches, began to overcome Amelia. I saw her lips whiten, and felt her hold upon my arm relax. I looked around an instant for a place whereon to lay her, and when I looked at her again, found that her eyes had become fixed on the side of the Virgin. Following its direction, I saw the black cat crouching out of sight. Her green eyes shone like danger lamps in the gloom of the place, and their color was heightened by the blood which still smeared her coat and reddened her mouth. I cried out, "The cat! Look out for the cat!" For even then she sprang out before the engine. At this very moment she looked like a triumphant demon. Her eyes blazed with ferocity, her hair bristled out till she seemed twice her normal size, and her tail lashed about as does a tiger's when the quarry is before it. Elias P. Hutcheson, when he saw her, was amused, and his eyes positively sparkled with fun as he said, "Derned if the squaw ain't got on all her war paint. Just give her a shove-off if she comes any of her tricks on me, for I'm so fixed everlastingly by the boss that durn my skin if I can keep my eyes from her if she wants them. Easy there, Judge. Don't you slack that ar rope, or I'm cutchered." At this moment Amelia completed her feint, and I had to clutch hold of her round the waist, or she would have fallen to the floor. Whilst attending to her, I saw the black cat crouching for a spring, and jumped up to turn the creature out. But at that instant, with a sort of hellish scream, she hurled herself, not as we expected at Hutcheson, but straight at the face of the custodian. Her claws seemed to be tearing wildly, as one sees in the Chinese drawings of the dragon rampant, and as I looked, I saw one of them light on the poor man's eye, and actually tear through it and down his cheek, leaving a wide band of red where the blood seemed to spurt from every vein. With a yell of sheer terror which came quicker than even his sense of pain, the man leaped back, dropping as he did the rope which held back the iron door. I jumped for it, but was too late, for the cord ran like lightning through the pulley block, and the heavy mass fell forward from its own weight. As the door closed, I caught a glimpse of our poor companion's face. He seemed frozen with terror. His eyes stared with a horrible anguish as if dazed, and no sound came from his lips. And then the spikes did their work. Happily, the end was quick, for when I wrenched open the door, they had pierced so deep that they had locked in the bones of the skull through which they had crushed, and actually tore him, out of his iron prison, till, bound as he was, he fell at full length with a sickly thud upon the floor, the face turning upwards as he fell. I rushed to my wife, lifted her up, and carried her out, for I feared for her very reason if she should wake from her faint to such a scene. I laid her on the bench outside and ran back. Leaning against the wooden column was the custodian, moaning in pain, whilst he held his reddening handkerchief to his eyes. And sitting on the head of the poor American was the cat, purring loudly as she licked the blood which trickled through the gashed sockets of his eyes. I hope no one will call me cruel, because I seized one of the old executioner's swords and shore her in two as she sat.